So here we have our quicksort. Pivot is set to 4, current is set to 7, and since 7 is greater than 4, we increment current.
So because the current is less than the pivot, we want to swap the 7 and the 1, and then we're going to move the wall up and then increment the current.
So now we check current and see if it is greater than pivot, in which it is. So we advance current.
So then we check current and see if it's less than pivot, which it is. So we swap current and 7, and we increment current, and we move the wall up.
So now the current is 3 and the pivot is 4. Since 3 is less than 4, we're going to swap the current with 5. And then we're going to increment the wall and increment the current.
Since current is greater than the pivot, all you have to do is increment current.
Since current is greater than the pivot, all we have to do is increment the current.
Since the current is greater than the pivot, all we have to do is swap the pivot and the 7. And then we're going to be putting a wall around the 4. And then all we have to do now is move the current to 1 and the pivot to 3.
Since current is less than the pivot, we increment current.
Since the current is less than the pivot, we know where the pivot is supposed to be since it's at the end, so we put a wall around the pivot. And you move current to 1 and pivot to 2.
Since current is less than pivot, you know the two are in the right spot. So you put a wall between them and then move current to 5 and pivot to 7.
Since current is less than pivot, we increment current and increment the wall.
Since the current is less than the pivot, we increment current and increment the wall.
Since current is greater than pivot, you increment current.
Since current is greater than the pivot, we swap 9 and 7 and put a wall around the 7, and then we move current to 5 and pivot to 6.
Since the current is less than the pivot, we know they're in the right space, so we put a wall between the two of them, and then we move the current to 8 and the pivot to 9.
Since current is less than pivot, we know the two are in the right spot, so we put a wall between them and then we're done.